Chapter 28 is looking at progressivism in the United States. A synonym for progressive is to be liberal or open to change. So this is an era from about 1901 to 1912 where the focus is on changing society for the better, to undo all of the corruption and laissez-faire that had occurred during the Gilded Age and change society for the better. So, progressivism as a political movement really has its roots in that old Greenback Labor Party and the Populist Party that we've already talked about, demanding social and economic change to make society better, especially as the gap between rich and poor continues to get larger and larger and larger. We've already seen that laissez-faire doesn't work, that hands-off mentality. So the progressives are looking for minor changes or minor modifications to society in order to make society more fair. But they don't want to go as far as communism. They don't want to go to that extreme. The majority of the progressives that participated in this political movement were actually from the middle class. So they didn't want to undo capitalism in general. They just wanted some changes to make society better. And in 1890, a very famous book was written known as How the Other Half Lives by Jacob A. Riis. Jacob A. Riis was a social reformer, he was a progressive, and he really wanted to open the middle class's eyes to the horrors that was life in the lower class. So he was also a photographer, so he went around the slums of New York taking photographs of life for these people living in poverty to showcase it to the middle class, to get them to obviously do something. And so just like we've seen with every other social movement, every reform movement in the past, middle-class women really begin participating in this movement to make changes to society, socially, politically, and economically as well. Here are some of the photographs that Jacob A. Riis took to horrify the middle class into doing something. So in the beginning of the 1900s, the popular magazines of the day, magazines like Cosmopolitan's, McClure's, Collier's, Everybody's, whatever, they were focusing on getting more readers to buy their magazines. So one of the techniques that they focused on to getting more readers to win the circulation wars was to have journalists write exposés. This is a story that exposes some terrible part of society. It's shocking, it's sensational, but in this case, unlike we saw with yellow journalism, these are true stories. So these journalists of the day, Teddy Roosevelt himself was a progressive looking to change society, but Teddy Roosevelt called these journalists muckrakers. This is a tool that is used to clean up pig poop out in the sty. Basically, he said, because all they're doing is focusing on the worst parts of society. So it is slightly derogatory, but the reality was that the stories that the muckrakers were writing actually did open up America's eyes to the horrors that was going on in the U.S. So some examples of these stories. Lincoln Steffens in 1902 wrote The Shame of the Cities. His focus here was on the corruption in city governments, in these boss-type city governments like Tammany Hall. Ida Tarbell wrote The Mother of Trusts, focusing on the corruption in Standard Oil. Her father had actually been ruined by Standard Oil and his monopoly that he created. David G. Phillips wrote The Treason of the Senate, focusing on the corrupt link between big business and senators, that senators aren't actually working for you, they're working for big business. And also John Spargo in 1906, The Bitter Cry of Children, focusing on how terrible child labor was. So all of these stories are meant to open up America's eyes, to get them to do something, to push for reform. It informed the public and outraged them, because these stories, while sensational, were actually true. So remember, progressivism is focusing on political change, economic change, social change. And progressives, while we like to put them into a category, are they Democrats, are they Republicans, the reality is they aren't associated, at this time at least, with one particular party. In fact, there were progressives in both the Democrats and the Republican Party. There were progressive Republicans like Teddy Roosevelt and progressive Democrats like Woodrow Wilson, who we'll talk about here in the future. The thing they have in common is they're focusing on improving the living and working conditions of Americans in the United States. Nothing to do with party, nothing to do with region. So several things that progressives wanted changed when it came to the political landscape. And some of these will sound familiar because they are exactly what the populists had been advocating back in the late 1800s. They wanted a direct election of all political office. Basically, the way candidates used to be chosen is that leading members of the party would go into a back smoke-filled room, if you will, and wheel and deal and make a determination and come out with their candidate. And then you ended up with fraudulent people like Rutherford B. Hayes or any of the people that Boss Tweed put forward in New York City. So by giving this ability to the people, you can now go to your polling place on primary election day and ask for either the Democratic ballot or the Republican ballot and vote for which one of the several candidates you want to represent your party in the next election or in the fall election. This is a primary election to determine the candidate for your political party. We have this today thanks to the progressives. They also wanted initiatives. This is the people get to propose legislation. So instead of letting your corrupt state government put forward all the legislation, if enough citizens sign a petition, they can get an issue put on the ballot, and then the common people can vote, and then it becomes a law within your state. So this is proposed legislation from the people, bypassing the state governments. They also wanted referendums, very similar to an initiative, but this is to withdraw an unpopular law from the state government. So let's say the state puts forward a law and they create this law, but it's very unpopular with the people. You can get enough signatures, put it on the ballot, and you can rescind or take back that unpopular law. Once again, giving power to the people. They also wanted the ability to recall elected officials. Mainly, if your governor's not doing a good enough job, get enough signatures, you have a recall election, he gets voted out of office before his term is actually over. The first four we do actually have today. Campaign finance reform, this is still something that is being debated still within the United States. How much money should people be able to contribute to a candidate? Is it bribery? Are businesses able to give this kind of money? This is still a debate that is going on today. Another political change that the progressives wanted was the Australian ballot. This is a secret ballot so that no longer can we bribe you into voting one way or another, because you'll never know how I vote with the Australian or the secret ballot. We also have this today. And then last but not least, the direct election of U.S. senators. So instead of leaving it up to the state legislatures like had been done before, now the people get to vote for who they want as their 2 senators per state. And this became law when the 17th Amendment was passed in 1913. So out of all 7 of these, 6 of them we have today. The campaign finance reform is something that is still being debated. Some campaign finance reform, but not as much as the progressives would have wanted. Their goal here is to give more power to the common man, to give more power to the people, or a grassroots approach from the ground up, as it's known. Now, the role of women. In 1911, to push for more reform in society, in 1911, a horrible factory fire occurred at the Triangle factory in New York City. Shirtwaist, this was a type of garment that women wore at the time, very popular. There were hundreds of women, mostly immigrant women, working at the Triangle Shirtwaist factory in 1911. Very little protection for workplaces. The codes that were put into place were largely ignored because, once again, we are in a period of time of laissez-faire where we keep our hands off. We let business do what business wants to do. So in 1911, though, a fire broke out at this factory in New York City, and 146 women actually did die during this fire because there wasn't the codes put in place. They didn't have an alarm system. They didn't have the fire escapes up to code. They were often rickety. Fire exits were locked because they'd been worried that women were going to be stealing stuff from the factory. Many of the women jumped to their death because they would rather do that than burn to death. So after the factory fire at the Triangle factory, people were horrified by this. They were completely outraged that nothing had been done to save these women's lives. And it was a gruesome event because people had to come by and look at their loved ones to see if it was them because they were so burned up. People were demanding change. They wanted change to the way cities were being run and more protection for workers in their factories. And so as a result of the factory fire at Triangle in 1911, we do start to see some change. Putting in more safety codes for workers, workers' compensation, insurance for industrial accidents. So it starts in New York, but it starts to spread to other states. 30 states by 1917 had enacted some reforms to protect people. The era of laissez-faire is slowly coming to an end. We also see women participating in the progressive movement and joining it with other reform movements that we've already talked about. Temperance, that idea to get rid of alcohol, is still going on. Women want to change society. So women like Frances E. Willard and the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, with 1 million women working to push for dry laws or to get rid of alcohol. So long before the 18th Amendment was actually ratified that prohibited the sale of alcohol, consumption of alcohol, etc., we did see dry laws across the United States in cities and in states before it went to a national level. Here are some pictures of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which made headlines all over the United States. So, back to the political side. In comes Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was a progressive reformer. He is a Republican, and he wanted to focus, his domestic policy became known as the square deal, to provide a square deal to everyone involved, or a fair deal to everyone involved, especially when it comes to the public, the labor, and the owners of businesses. Everyone should have the right to have a square deal, he said. So his domestic policy is his policy dealing with the United States. And it really focuses on the 3 C's: to control corporations, protect the consumer, and conservation of natural resources. These 3 C's are going to be the focus of his domestic policy. And it came to a test in 1902. The United Mine Workers in Pennsylvania went on strike in the anthracite coal mines. 140,000 workers walked off the job site, demanding a 9-hour workday and a 20% pay increase. The mine owners absolutely refused to negotiate with the union. They don't want to recognize the union. They definitely don't want to pay their workers any more money. But the problem comes in that the majority of the heating in the United States at this time is done through anthracite coal. We're coming up to winter, and without this coal, many of the houses and businesses won't be able to be heated. Now, in the past, as we've already talked about, presidents during the Gilded Age would have stepped in but sided with the owners. They would have sent in the military or a police force in order to bring an end to this strike. But instead, Teddy Roosevelt took a different approach. He wanted to provide a square deal to everyone involved. So Teddy Roosevelt brought both the union and the mine owners together and said, either you come to a compromise or else I'm going to step in and federalize this mine. Now, what this would mean is that he would use U.S. troops to do the mining, taking control away from the owners, which obviously they don't want to do because they're going to lose money, and also taking jobs away from the workers, which obviously they don't want to lose their job. So either work together, come to a compromise, or I'm going to step in and nobody will be happy. So in the end, a compromise was reached, a 10% pay increase, a 9-hour workday, but they didn't have to recognize the union. And so this is important. It's a major change in American policy because even though he didn't 100% side with the miners, he didn't also 100% side with the coal mine owners either. He provided a square deal to everyone. The consumer gets their coal for the winter, the miners get to keep their jobs, and the mine owners get to keep their mines operating. Everyone gets something out of the deal. In 1903, we also see under Teddy Roosevelt's administration the creation of the Department of Commerce and Labor. This is going to be out of this department. The Bureau of Corporations will be created that's going to focus on trust busting or breaking apart unruly monopolies, which we'll talk about next. So as we've already talked about, there is this need to curb the power of these large monopolies. Monopolies or trusts have really been taking over control of the American business at this time. We need a law with stronger teeth in it. Now remember, we already have the Sherman Antitrust Act, but it's largely been ignored. We have the Interstate Commerce Commission, but it's not really doing its job the way it should have. So in 1903, Congress passed the Elkins Act to curb the power of the railroads, that they can't give rebates to certain people or friends of theirs, which is basically a discount on rail travel. So some people get a cheaper rate versus others. That is made illegal by the Elkins Act. In 1906, Congress passes the Hepburn Act, which also said you can't give free passes on the railroad, which was just another way to bribe somebody into doing what they wanted to, because obviously with cheaper rail travel, you can lower the price of your product because it doesn't cost as much to ship. The Hepburn Act also expanded the Interstate Commerce Commission to oversee this. Now, really, Teddy Roosevelt, he was known as the trust buster. He wanted to focus his attention on the bad trusts, or those trusts that he saw as greedy or he saw as corrupt. He didn't think all trusts were bad. There are good trusts, he said. Leave the good ones alone that are focusing on the best interests of the public. But let's break apart these bad trusts that are greedy and corrupt. And so for the first time ever, the Sherman Antitrust Act was actually used to do what it was supposed to do in 1902, to break apart the Northern Securities Company. This was a company owned by J.P. Morgan and James J. Hill. This was a railroad holding company. They appealed this all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that they had to dissolve because they were in restraint of trade. So for the first time since 1890, when the Sherman Antitrust Act was passed, we actually see it being used for the right reasons. Following the breakup of the Northern Securities Company under Teddy Roosevelt, 44 other lawsuits were brought against trusts in the beef industry, sugar, fertilizing industry, harvesting equipment, etc., 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 to break apart the bad trusts, according to Teddy Roosevelt, that really are in restraint of trade. Now, even though Teddy Roosevelt has the nickname of the Trust Buster, really the real Trust Buster was his successor, William Howard Taft. In his one term, he ended up breaking apart 90 trusts, which we'll talk about later on.